Good morning.
Good morning.
Open up, if you would, to Daniel, the second chapter this morning, please. Daniel chapter 2. Our kids are studying about building a life for God. And the section that we're going to look at in Daniel today is actually a section that comes out of their curriculum. They were looking in class this morning or this week at the first three chapters of Daniel. The story that's told in chapter 1 about where Daniel and his three friends are taken into captivity and how they refuse to eat the things that come from the king's table. And then the story that we're going to look at in Daniel chapter 2, where King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of a huge statue, an awesome statue, when Daniel is telling the dream that Nebuchadnezzar saw. And Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar what the meaning of it is. And then in the third chapter, they're looking this week at the story of when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fiery furnace by the king because they wouldn't bow down before the image that he built, that he commanded the people to worship. So I want us to look together at the story here in Daniel chapter 2. This story has a lot of meaning to me because I can remember the first time that I ever heard the story in Daniel 2. Or if it wasn't the first time I heard it, was the first time that I listened, that it meant something to me. I was about Abraham's age. Dave Long and I and a couple other guys were the boys' class at the congregation where I was growing up. And we didn't have a classroom for us to meet in, so we were actually meeting in the hallway. It was a hallway like the ones here where you can exit the building. And it was kind of a makeshift classroom for us. And Sandy Berry, who was our teacher at the time, had painted the door black so that the door could double as a blackboard. And so Dave and I and our friends, we were all in a half circle around Sandy, and he was teaching us from Daniel chapter 2. And the reason why it had such an impact on me that day is that we just happened to be studying from the similar events in world history at school. And so I had heard stories about King Nebuchadnezzar in school. And I had heard about the coming of the Persian Empire and the coming of Alexander the Great and the spreading of Greek culture, and then about the Romans that followed. And so as he described to us, as he drew a picture on the board of this statue, and as he talked about the gold and the silver and the bronze and the legs of iron and clay. It was the first time that I remember as a young person thinking, this stuff is real. I mean, this is real. There are things that I'm learning about in school that are history, and this really happened. And God told about things that were happening before they happened. 600 years before they happened, he was talking about things that were happening, and he showed it to men like Daniel. And Daniel, this all started with him when he was about my age, when he was carried away into captivity as an early teen. How awesome that God would use someone like him, and that he would reveal these things to his people. And so this story has a lot of meaning to me, because of the aha moment that I had as an early teen, learning about these things for the first time. So here's the story in Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar is the king. He is the despot. I mean, he is the one in charge of the most powerful kingdom on earth in his day. It's around 600 or so BC. And he is it. I mean, he is the king of the hill. He is in charge of a great empire, the Babylonian Empire. And they have come, and they are overrunning the countryside. Daniel's own city, the city of Jerusalem, and his own people have been completely decimated by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar came and he wiped out their city. He tore down the temple of God. He took the people captive. And before he tore down the city and tore down the temple and took the people captive, he had taken some of the elite people of noble birth, had been taken captive by him earlier. And so Daniel and his friends and other young Jewish boys had been taken into Nebuchadnezzar's court, and they underwent a period of education so that they could be servants in his cabinet. They could be wise men and confidants and people that would give expertise about the culture from which they came, as well as to be educated in all the culture of the Babylonians, and for him to surround himself with the best minds so that he could make for himself a great kingdom and a great culture. And Daniel was one of the wise men that was in King Nebuchadnezzar's confidence. Well, in the second year of his reign, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And the dream caused him great trouble. And so he gathered together. It was troubling because it caused him to be anxious. He didn't get the meaning of it. And there were things that were awesome in the dream, and there were things that were violent. And so he called together all of the wisest people in his kingdom, and he told them about the dream, that he had a dream. And they said, "Well, King Nebuchadnezzar, tell us the dream, and we'll tell you what it means." That's easy. And King Nebuchadnezzar knew the ways of conjurers and sorcerers and wise men. And he said, "No, I'm not going to tell you the dream. I want you all to tell me the dream. So you tell me what I dreamed, and then tell me the meaning of it. I'm not going to tell you the dream first, because I want proof that you really know that what you're talking about. And so if you have keen insight, you'll know what the dream is." Well, they said, Nobody can do that. Nobody can tell you what the dream is first. You tell us the dream, and then we'll tell you the meaning. Never has a king asked for wise men to tell them the dream that he saw, the vision that he saw in his sleep. And King Nebuchadnezzar said, "Well, I'm telling you, and if you can't tell me the dream, then I'm going to tear you limb from limb. All the wise men and all the empire are going to die unless you can find a wise man among you that can tell me the meaning of the dream." They were at a loss. None of them could do that. And so the instructions were given to his soldiers to go throughout the empire and to destroy every wise man. And a fellow named Arioch, who was over the Nebuchadnezzar's bodyguard, came to Daniel's house to kill him. And Daniel, very calmly and very shrewdly, asked Arioch, "Why is this all so urgent? What's going on here?" And he explained to him the whole matter. And Daniel said, "Give me some time, and I will give the king the interpretation." So Daniel went. He was given permission to have a little time. I don't know how long that time was. But he went and he got his friends together, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he asked them to pray that the God of mercy would show compassion and would show him the meaning of the dream. And it came to him in the night. God showed him the dream, and God showed him the meaning. And Daniel prayed a very meaningful prayer in verses 20 and following of Daniel chapter 2, where he praised God, who raises up kings, who exalts kings, and who brings them down, and who establishes times and epochs. He praised God because God was so compassionate to show him the meaning of the dream. So Daniel went before Nebuchadnezzar and was introduced by Arioch. I love the way Arioch describes himself. He says, "I have found the one." When Arioch comes and appears before the king, "I have found," he says, "a man who was one of the exiles from Judah, who can interpret your dream, O king." And so Nebuchadnezzar asked Daniel if that was in fact the case. And Daniel very humbly says that there is no wise man, there is no conjurer, there is no sorcerer who can interpret the dream of the king. He said the only one who can do that is God, the God of heaven. And He is the one who has shown the future to the king. And he says, "I am not a great man, I am not a wise man. God has condescended to give me the meaning so that you can understand. Not because of any wisdom that I have, but He has. He has given this so that you, king, can understand what the future is going to be." And so Daniel told him about how in the night he saw this vision of this awesome statue with a head and shoulders that were made of gold, and with a chest and with arms that were made of silver, and with hips and thighs that were made of bronze, and with legs and with feet that were made of iron mixed with clay. And while he was observing this wonderful, this awesome statue that stood before him, there was this rock that was cut out without hands. And this rock came and it either rolled or it flew. I don't know which was the case, but this rock came and it smashed the statue. And it smashed the statue to such an extent that it was reduced completely to dust. He said it was like the stuff that's left over, the chaff that's left over when you sift wheat. That's all it was. And the wind came and it blew away all the dust, so there was no evidence at all left of that great statue. And the rock that smashed the statue started to grow, and it became a huge mountain that filled the whole earth. And then Daniel explained to him what the meaning of the dream was. He said, that head and those shoulders of gold, he said, that's you, king. God has made you the king over a great empire. It's the greatest, you're the greatest king on earth. And God has given that to you. But there's going to come another kingdom after you. And it's the kingdom that's made of silver. And after that kingdom, God is going to set up another kingdom. It's the kingdom that's made of bronze. And when that kingdom goes away, God's going to send a fourth kingdom. It's made of iron and made of clay. And in the days of those kings, in the days of that fourth empire, God is going to set up His kingdom. And His kingdom is going to obliterate all the other kingdoms of men. And it's going to be the greatest kingdom ever. It's going to be universal. And it will be forever. He said, that's the meaning of the dream that you've had, O king. And Nebuchadnezzar was a believer. He was convicted by the dream that Daniel, telling him the vision and telling him the interpretation of the vision. And so Nebuchadnezzar said to him in his closing remarks in verse 47 of Daniel chapter 2, the king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you've been able to reveal this mystery. And so Nebuchadnezzar was totally impressed with the insight that God had given to Daniel, and placed the explanation for that insight in the proper place in the praise that he gave to God for the answer that God had provided. I want you to think about who Daniel is in the world in which he lives. I mean, he's not significant. He was not the first wise man that Nebuchadnezzar went to and asked for an answer about his dream. It was only when Arioch, his bodyguard, the head of his bodyguard, started going through and slaying the wise men that Daniel comes to the fore as someone who has an answer here. Now, I expect part of what's happening in Daniel chapter 2 is where it's being explained to us. There's a lot more than just this, but one of the things that's being explained to us is how Daniel came into such good favor with King Nebuchadnezzar, how he arose to such priority and to such to be so well known in the Babylonian in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. One of the explanations for that is what happened with this vision that came to Daniel, and why he was invited into not only the confidence of King Nebuchadnezzar, but of the Persian Empire that followed King Nebuchadnezzar. But Daniel he has no political power. He's not in charge of any army. He's not in a position of strength. He's in a position of weakness. King Nebuchadnezzar has sent his men to go kill men like Daniel. And Daniel was taken away from his homeland when he was a boy. He was orphaned when he was taken away from his family, and has been made to serve the empire that decimated his own people, that completely wreaked havoc on his own land. He was made a slave, a servant of the enemy of his people. And that's the way he spent his days, all of his days, serving them. He never went home like so many other Jews did. He stayed always a captive his whole days. The reason I want us to think about the story of Daniel is because I think it's so relevant to us in our times in this respect. How much control do you feel like you have over the state of our country? How much control do you feel that you have over the direction of policies and laws? How much control do you feel like you have over what's happening in the world right now? What's happening in wars? What's happening in our government? What's happening in our culture? What's happening in our economy? How much control do you have over all that? Do you feel powerful? Do you feel like you can make a difference in what's going on in the world? I just want you to see that the position of Daniel in relation to Nebuchadnezzar's empire is no different than the position that we are in relation to our nation and in relation to world affairs. In fact, I can't ever think of a time, I mean, there are a couple exceptions, maybe in the time of David when he was a king, but I can't think of a time when God's people have been in positions of great strength, where they were the ones in charge politically, where the people of God were the ones who were really in charge of what was going on economically or militarily. God's people have always been in positions of weakness. And yet, let me ask you this question about Daniel. Who is the difference maker in Daniel chapter 2? Yeah, God is. And God's people. I mean, who has the answers to what God's doing? Who has been invited into God's confidence about what is going on in world affairs? And who is the one that is able to tell the story to others about what is really going on in the world, whether you can see it or not? And even before it happens, it's God's people, is it not? And so the point that I want us to see from this great story is that God's people are the difference makers. It doesn't matter how weak God's people are. It doesn't matter how lacking we are of political power. It doesn't matter how weak we are when it comes to economic or financial backing. It doesn't matter how weak we are when it comes to military strength. God's people have always been the difference makers in the world, no matter how frail or how feeble they were. And the thing that makes them the difference makers in the world is who they belong to. They belong to God, who is the one who is in charge, who is the one that's in control. And how is it that God's difference makers, how is it that we make a difference? The ways that we make a difference, the ways that we, in the vernacular of what the kids are learning, the ways that we build a life for God are the same ways that we make a difference in the world. The tools that we have for building a life for God is the same way that we leverage the strength that God has given us to make a difference in the world around us. And I just want to look very simply and quickly at the things that Daniel did to make a difference that are the ways that we make a difference. What are they? Number one, those that are difference makers for God pray to the God of heaven. Those that are the difference makers for God pray to the God of heaven. Look at what happens in verse 17 of Daniel chapter 2. When Daniel went to his house, Daniel 2 verse 17, Daniel went to his house and informed his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter, in order that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. What was the biggest thing that Daniel and his friends did first? They prayed. And over again, this is the way that God is referenced in the text. The same way that He's referenced here in verses 17 and 18. He's called the God of heaven. He went and he bid them pray that the God of heaven would show compassion. Because you know what? The God of heaven, He's in charge. And so when we, exercise the privilege that we have of expressing our wishes, of expressing our longings, of asking for help, of asking for wisdom, of asking for insight, of asking for intervention from the God of heaven. There is nothing more powerful that you can do, Christian. There's nothing greater that you can do, brother and sister. There is no more greater power that we can bring to bear on any situation, whether it be political, whether it be personal, whatever it is. If it's a matter of health or need or wisdom, there is no greater source that we can turn to than to turn to God and say, God, help us. And did He? Yes, He did. And what should Daniel have done first other than that? That was the wisest thing he could do. It's the way he did build a life for God, but it's the way he made a difference in the world and in the national affairs of the most powerful empire in his time. Daniel prayed. I just want to say that that's the way you make a difference. When you pray for Little Weston, and when you pray for Jerry Rogers, and when you pray for Jen's mom, and when you pray for Maureen's dad, and when you pray for the Fergusons, and when you say to God the names of people, when you say to God the needs that we have, our God hears. We serve the God of heaven that answers. What a privilege that is. The second thing that Daniel did is he blessed the God of heaven from a grateful heart. Look at verse 19. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And we find then the praise that Daniel answered. This is what he said about the God of heaven that he served. Let the name of the Lord be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to Him. Do you believe that? Our God is wise and powerful. It is He who changes the times and the epochs. It is not our government that decides what the future is going to be, that decides what morality is going to be. God is the one who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings. He establishes kings. He raises nations and He raises nations. He does both. He lifts them up and he erases them. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to the men of understanding. Isn't that beautiful? Daniel praising God out of a grateful heart for how God hears and for how God answers. And one of the ways that you and I make a difference in the world is when we praise God with a heart of gratitude for how He answers. You see, that's how we grow our relationship with Him. That's how we keep ourselves in a healthy state of mind, is when we recognize that what is happening and what God is doing, that the things that are occurring in our world are coming from His hand. That the state of affairs for us and for our environment, for what's happening right now, is from Him. And when we acknowledge that, when we praise Him for that, when we see where we are and where He is, and whatever we know about what's going on, or whatever wisdom we have, or whatever strength we have to respond to what's going on, when we acknowledge that it all comes from Him, it keeps us in a proper perspective. It keeps us in a proper state of heart and mind. It did that for Daniel. It's the reason he speaks so humbly, as we'll see in just a moment, when he goes before the king. But because he knows that whatever he's able to do right here is only because of the wisdom that God has given, the strength that God has brought, and so he gives it all back to God. And the difference makers in the world are people that do that. They're people that ask God, and they're people who thank God when God responds. The third thing that Daniel does that is the way of a difference maker is he is truly humble before men and before the God of heaven. He's not a man who plays humble. He is a man who really is humble. Look, if you would, at verse 28 of the text, when Daniel stands before King Nebuchadnezzar. Actually, verse 27 is where I want you to start. Daniel answered before the king and said, "As for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. He says this kind of wisdom doesn't come from men. Not me, not anybody. He says in verse 28, however, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and He has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. I want you to see the total humility and the way that Daniel expresses himself to Nebuchadnezzar. There is no me in that. There is no I in that. There is no we in that. Daniel has completely removed himself from having any importance in the things that are unfolding here. He says there is no wise man that has an answer here. And he says the God of heaven is the only one that knows. And he doesn't say the God of heaven has revealed it to me. He says the God of heaven has revealed it to you, O king. And so he takes himself completely out of the picture. Those are the words of a really humble man. Of a man who really doesn't see himself as having any personal importance. And that's the way Daniel expresses himself here. He says in verse 29, as for you, O king, while on your bed your thoughts turn to what would take place in the future. And He who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. And then finally here in verse 30 is where Daniel talks about himself. He says, as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me more than any other living man. I'm no better than the rest of your magicians. I'm no better than all these other soothsayers that you call. I'm no wiser than any other man that's living. He says, but for the purpose of making, he said, the only reason why God has told me this is for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. Do you see how humble that is? He says, I'm nobody. The only reason why God has decided to show me this is so that He can communicate it to you. Now those are a man, unless a man's truly humble, he doesn't talk that way. And I just want us to see that if we really want to make a difference in the world, that's the kind of people we got to be. I mean, we got to be really humble people. Really humble. Not just humble in front of God, but humble in front of the man who killed your countrymen. Humble before the king who wiped out the city of Jerusalem. Humble before the king, whether he be Nebuchadnezzar, or he be Obama, or he be some other potentate, whoever it is that's in charge. Humble before someone whose morality we don't agree with. Humble before the man that we regard to be an enemy. Humble before the man that's a pagan and an atheist or a polytheist. Daniel is humble in front of everyone. He's a humble man. And we got to see ourselves that way. And when we are really humble, men like Nebuchadnezzar will listen to really humble men. Really humble men can make a difference in the world. That proud men, even men with a little pride, when they think it's about them, they can't do it. But a humble man, he can make a difference, and so does Daniel. I want you to see that the difference makers are the people that serve the people that God has put in their path. The difference makers are the people who serve the people that God has put in their path. That's an expression of that kind of humility. Look at verse 36. Look at the way Daniel expresses the dream to the king. He says, this was the dream. Now we shall tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, He has given them into your hand, and has caused you to rule over them. You are the head of gold. The point that I want you to be impressed with is just the fact that Daniel always behaved like a servant. He was all his life a slave to someone else. Daniel was never a free man. He rubbed shoulders, he rubbed elbows with people in high places. He served Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of the most powerful empire in his time. And when Nebuchadnezzar's empire went away, then he served in the court of the next empire that came to power. But he was always a servant. He was always in a position of weakness. He was always having to do things at someone else's bidding. And I never see, ever in Daniel, any kind of bitterness, any kind of self-pity, any kind of poor me, all the stuff that's happened to me, any kind of attitude of where is God in the things that are happening in my life. There is instead always in Daniel this servant disposition. I don't know what God is doing maybe right now. I don't know where things are going, but I know He does. And I know He's put me here to be a servant. And if He's put me to be a servant in Nebuchadnezzar's court, then I'm going to be the best wise man that I can be. And I'm going to give Nebuchadnezzar the wisest counsel that I can give him. I'm going to tell him things straight up. I'm going to be candid with him. And yet I am always going to exercise my role as a servant. And I'm going to do that to the best of my ability. And Daniel was completely faithful in serving his enemies his whole life. I'm so impressed with that. He did it for like 80 years. He exercised the role of a servant. Difference makers do that. The final thing that I want you to see is that people that make a difference, God's difference makers, share the truth of God of heaven, share the truth of the God of heaven with kindness and with candor. Daniel doesn't pull any punches in the truth that he tells, but he tells it with kindness, but he also tells it quite candidly. And he's heard when he does so. Look at what it says in verse 44 of Daniel chapter 2. And in the days of those kings, that's the kings that are represented by the iron and clay. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put to end all these kingdoms, but it itself will endure forever. And inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. I don't know if there was a lump at all in Daniel's throat as he tells to King Nebuchadnezzar that your kingdom is going away. I mean, you're the head of gold, but the head of gold lasted less than any of the other kingdoms when it was all said and done. It lasted less than 100 years. And then the Persians came along, and they were around for a couple hundred years. And then the Greeks came along, led by Alexander the Great, and Greek culture spread throughout the world for about 300 years. And then the Romans came along right before the time of Jesus. But Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar the truth about what was going to happen, about what the meaning of the dream was. He didn't spare any detail of it. And Nebuchadnezzar listened. And Nebuchadnezzar was impacted by the truth that he shared. The difference makers can do that. They can tell people the truth. And they can tell it with respect. Daniel's always respectful, and he doesn't sneer when he talks to Nebuchadnezzar. He doesn't do anything to show any disrespect. He's always respectful, but he tells the truth. He tells it kindly, but he tells it candidly to him. And when it's all said and done, Nebuchadnezzar, I just love how effective Daniel was, because Nebuchadnezzar doesn't come away impressed with Daniel. He comes away impressed with God. He says to him, verse 47, "Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of lords and a revealer of mysteries." Isn't that something? That Daniel spoke and influenced in such a way that what Nebuchadnezzar was impressed with, when it was all said and done, he was impressed with God. He was impressed with Daniel's God. I don't know how long that lasted. In the next chapter, Nebuchadnezzar's building a statue and asking people to worship it. But for that moment, for that time, it had an impact. And people that are the difference makers. You see, the reason why they can share the truth is because of all the other things that they've done. When you pray to the God of heaven, when you thank the God of heaven, when you're truly humble before men and the God of heaven, when you serve the people that God puts in your path, when you do those things, you can talk to people. You can share truth with people. You can tell them things because you have credibility with them. And Daniel does those things. And so God gives him an audience with kings. And he does even more than that. He gives Daniel what became a calendar for God's people so that as things unfolded in their world, they knew when Babylon came to an end that God was about to set up another empire. And they could make sense of the Persians when they came on the scene. And when Alexander the Great, in a little over a decade, completely takes over the world, they understood what was going on because God had showed them the kingdom of bronze. And when Caesar, when Julius crosses the Rubicon, and when he comes to Palestine and he draws the line in the sand, when he does all of those things, they can make sense of it because God had showed them through Daniel that he was going to do all of these things. Nobody, listen folks, for 600 years, nobody had more insight into what God was doing in the world than God's people did because God had shown them what he was doing. Let me ask you this, who has more insight into what God is doing in the world right now than you folks? Nobody knows more about what the purpose of God is right now for everyone in the world than God's people do. Now, does that give you any confidence? Now, I don't mean self-confidence. I mean God confidence because, listen, we are the rock. We are that stone that was cut out without hands, that has grown up into a mountain. We are a part of a kingdom that cannot be shaken. We have received the King who has set up his forever kingdom. We are his people. And we are still in positions of weakness. But we make a difference. We're purposed to make a difference in all these ways that we've described because we pray, because we thank God, and because we're really humble in our service, because we serve people, and because we tell people the truth the way God would have it. Make a difference for God. That's our purpose. Even in times like these, faith was made for times like these. If you need to erect your life for God, if you need to start building over again, today's a great day to start with the right kind of foundation, with the right kind of appeal to God to take away your sins. Would you not come to him in faith? Would you not come to him repenting of your wrongs, willing to change your life? Won't you confess that you believe that Jesus is the Son of God and be buried with him in baptism? He can wash away your sins and you can be a follower of his and make a difference for him and for eternity. Won't you come as we stand and as we sing?